Can finance executives really make good use of sustainability metrics for reporting? I'm Bart van Ark, Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and welcome to our window on sustainability metrics for the finance function. Hello and welcome to our monthly window on, which for this month of January we're going to talk about sustainability metrics, and particular sustainability metrics that are being used in the finance function of corporations. This is really this month's focus on sustainability, in particular this intense involvement in the financial community is a hot topic. As many of you know, Davos is happening right now, the World Economic Forum, a lot of discussion happening there about climate change and sustainability. So the timing of this webcast is just absolutely perfect to be here. And we have a great panel of experts to be with us here today. Before I start, some of you are attending this webcast and can earn CPE credits for it. If that's the case, then please type your full name and email address in the space provided. Click OK for free pop-ups that occur during the program. Stay online for the entire webcast. And credit is, of course, only available for participation in this webcast. So let's set the scene a little bit. We have the World Economic Forum right now. Last week, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink came out with his annual letter for investors, stating that BlackRock would now begin moving away from thermal coal investments. This is a clear sign that the world's largest asset managers is actually taking climate change really serious. BlackRock is, of course, not new to the theme. Fink has talked about this before, and they are hardly, of course, the first firm to really consider environmental, social, and governance factors in its portfolio. Sustainable investing, which takes into account the risks of global warming and its effects on companies' assets, has been gaining a lot of steam in the past few years. But there seems to be a little bit of a sense of greater urgency among the investment and business community. To cite Larry Fink here, he says, awareness of climate change is rapidly changing, and I believe we are on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. And then later on in this letter, he says, companies, investors, and governments must prepare for a significant reallocation of capital. So those are not small words that are being used here. It has not gone unchanged, of course, with people in the finance function in both public and private companies. Disclosure measures until recently were basically seen by the finance functions as a nice thing to have, but we've always been a little bit wary of using them in financial reporting because of the vagueness of some of these measures, the lack of consensus about what the right metrics really are. So where do we need to go with this? How can the finance function, the finance community move the ball forward and be a contributor in a call for greater sustainability of business practices? That's what we're going to talk about today in this webcast, which really comes into three portions. We'll first start a little more talking about the changing societal and business approaches to sustainability. And we're going to make use of Larry Fink's letter, a few quotes of that letter, and have our panelists react to questions. Why is there this sudden higher level of attention? And also, how do we think about all these issues from a perspective of environment, sustainability, social and governance versus social responsibility investing? Secondly, the main portion of our program today is indeed about the state of the art with sustainability metrics for the finance function. Are the metrics of sufficient quality for financial reporting? Should sustainability metrics be fully integrated in a company's reporting system? Who should own sustainability data? Should the finance control all the reporting, including sustainability reporting? And is there a role for public policy to actually set some standards? And then finally, we're going to talk about some of the broader implications for the finance function, the overall engagement of financial executives on sustainability strategy and overall business strategies in this respect. So with that, I can now start, because I'm obviously not going to do it on my own. Actually, I'm only going to drive the discussion and listen to three key experts in this area. And I would like to start with introducing Brad Sparks. Brad is the director of the US chapter for Accounting for Sustainability CFO Leadership Network, which is part of the Prince of Wales's Accounting for Sustainability project. He is running the US chapter. Brad was previously an executive director at KPMG, working with clients on all issues around sustainability and sustainability reporting. Brad, it's great to have you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And then I'm very happy to have on the call Klaus Agard. Klaus is the CFO of Mars Incorporated. He was appointed CFO in 2016, having worked in multiple positions in the company. Klaus is very engaged on the topic of sustainability in the finance function, part of our CFO 250 Council at the Conference Board. Klaus, it's great to have you in today and hear your practitioner view on sustainability reporting and accounting.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And then finally, with me in the studio is my colleague Paul Washington. Paul is the Executive Director for our ESG Center at the Conference Board, Environment, Social and Governance. And Paul has been with the Conference Board for about a year and in previous positions have been working with Time Warner and a lot of other organizations. Paul, welcome to this discussion.
Thanks. Delighted to be here and in such good company.
Very good. Yeah, it will be a great webcast. And I think what we're going to do right away, before we get into the details, is we want to do a poll question. We want to ask you as an audience a question to see what your thinking is. And what we're going to do for that is to put up the following statement, which my colleagues are going to show you right now. And that statement is, the business community needs to respond more proactively to the societal pressures towards climate change risk and sustainability initiatives. So the business community needs to respond more proactively to the societal pressures towards climate change risk and sustainability initiatives. Do you strongly agree with that? Do you somewhat agree with that? Do you not really have an opinion, or do you actually disagree with it, which is also quite legitimate, because it has quite some implications, as we will hear during this webcast, when you agree with this statement. So we'll leave it open for a few more seconds, and then I'm going to ask each of our panel members to very briefly respond to comments. So we give it a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. Great. So, of course, and perhaps not surprising, otherwise you perhaps would not have attended this webcast, but still, 60%, 55%, 56% of you are saying you strongly agree with the need for a more proactive involvement. 38% of you are actually, I somewhat agree with that, and actually I'd like to hear why we only agree somewhat with it. And also some of you are saying, well, I don't really agree or disagree with this. Paul, very quickly, 30 seconds. Is that what you hear around? Is this about the distribution of the opinions on this?
I think actually, to talk to corporate members, I think most of them would agree or strongly agree, but there are those who are a little bit of skeptics in this area in boardrooms across the U.S.
Skeptics whether we can really do this.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would sort of touch on, it does say respond to societal pressures, and I think societal pressures here are only part of the equation. There are other pressures that may require people to respond.
That's a very good point. Klaus, your first response.
Well, it's in line with what I think I would have, expected, and I'll talk a little bit later about how, even whether you think you have a big impact or not, why I don't think necessarily you have a choice. So I'm delighted to see that the community on this call, is in favor of the businesses also contributing to this. It doesn't mean having to solve all problems, but we are part of the solution and part of the problem here as well. And the more people that think this way, the better chance we have of doing so.
Absolutely. Brad, satisfied with this response here?
Yeah, I think that's what we're seeing today largely. If you look at the conversations in Davos, which was referenced earlier, this is increasing focus on a concept of stakeholder capitalism. And I think as we think about business response and business opportunity to address some of these societal issues, the trend is moving in the direction of support towards this type of statement.
Great. Thank you very much. So let's go right away into the first section to really talk a little bit more about what has changed in terms of societal and business approaches to sustainability. And as I said before, what I'd really like to do is to actually use that letter of Larry Fink and use a few quotes there. Actually, those were quotes that were highlighted in his letter, so I didn't sort of select those myself. He selected them as his most important points. And each of you, I want to respond to a few of those quotes. And Paul, I'd like to start with you to discuss the first two. Awareness of climate change is rapidly changing, and I believe we're on the edge of a fundamental reshaping of finance. That's, of course, the important part there. And secondly, every government, company, and shareholder must confront climate change. My question here is really, what is driving that urgency? What is sort of changing their mind? I mean, he's been talking about this before, but he has increased the level of urgency. And why is that happening?
Sure. I think there are a number of reasons for that. And one thing I'd start off by saying is I think this is different from other crises that have affected changes in governance and approaches by corporations. This isn't the collapse of Enron and WorldCom. It's not the financial crisis. This is really a persistent kind of phenomenon that we're dealing with here. And I think there are a number of factors. First of all, I think the greater accumulation of science on this is in fact driving this. I think it's pressure from the clients that BlackRock and other investment managers have, as well as pressure from consumers and employees to see action in this area. When it comes to government, I think there are two sides. There are increasing regulations in this area, including coming out of the EU, which I think we can talk about later. But it's also the absence of regulation to some extent in the United States that's causing people to look to companies to take a stronger position here. And then I think it's also the general environment for corporations where they are facing both increased skepticism about their role in society and higher expectations. So I think it's a confluence of all of those factors. And all of those factors I see persisting at least for a while, whether it's regulation, investor, consumer pressure, this environment where companies are caught between higher expectations and skepticism, and probably consistent, sort of scientific discoveries that are all driving this and moving it up in the agenda.
So I'm an economist, right?
Yeah.
So I'm always looking at and always think, people are only going to change if the incentive is there, whether it's a positive or a negative incentive here. But what about all these, wildfires in Australia and California, floods around the world? Isn't it just sort of also just a feeling like we got to do something here? Because I mean, it's hard. I know this sometimes is felt as a political statement, but I think most people would agree that climate change is probably playing a role here.
Yeah, or extreme weather, even if you take the climate change terminology. People are aware of this, but I think that's then combined with the fact of, okay, someone's got to do something about it. And in some cases, governments are pushing companies to do it. In other cases, the absence of government action is causing investors, employees, and customers to say, okay, companies, you have to step up in this area. And so I think all of that's sort of driving this.
Klaus, let me go to you and ask you about the sort of third and the fourth statement on this slide from things that are, a company cannot achieve long-term profits without embracing purpose and considering the needs of a broad range of stakeholders. And then the fourth one saying, in the near future and sooner than most anticipate, there will be a significant reallocation of capital, which is, again, not a small thing to say. So my question to you is, first of all, would you agree that this is widely felt in the business community, significantly more widely felt? And what is kind of the tipping point for a company to sign up to those kind of statements in the way that Fink does?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I agree, with everything that Paul said before, and I think, this is definitely one of the reasons why, this is not a choice for the business community also to have a point of view on and do something about. I mean, in my world, and obviously I can mostly talk about how we think here at Mars, but I have many colleagues out there that I'm also talking to, and I think we all approach it differently and yet in a similar direction. I think about this year as a CFO and an economist, very simple in a sense, following a good, well-trotted value creation formula, which is, you've got to grow your business, attract and innovate, and so you get consumers into your franchise, and you've got to have a good return on capital, and through that have some distinctive advantages. And you need to focus on having a sustainable business model that is modern to the times. And I think the pressure from, of course, regulators and the markets out there, but also from consumers and the talent that we've got to attract is very significant. And if I think part of this here is it's in one sense table stakes, and it is in one sense what consumers and talent are looking for you to do as a responsible citizen, in this environment, in this community that we operate. And I mean, whether one believes that we're near a catastrophe or not, there's a lot of data that is clear that is going beyond wildfires. It's plastic, it's poverty, it's child abuse. It's a whole host of things that in the world where we've gotten to, I think we find is no longer acceptable for whatever reasons. Catastrophe, or it's just not humanely the right thing to do. So the tipping point, I think there's been clearly an upsurge in this. And when I talk to more publicly listed colleagues out there, clearly, in the last 2 years, the questions, the scrutiny, the focus on this has gone up dramatically, particularly here in the United States. It's maybe a bit earlier in Europe, and I think it's a good thing. And clearly in our own context with a privately held company, our shareholders are very much on this agenda and is pushing management to do the right things.
So it's interesting that your point is really the business cases there, right? So whatever happens outside, you can build a good business case. You see the incentives that are coming from investors, from your customers, but the regulators, of course, you have to respond to. But you also make that specific point about attracting talent, or basically, there is a need to change the company culture in order to satisfy the people who work for your company. So you think that is also a very important point of making the business case.
It's very important. I mean, in the end, it comes down to people in the business, and this simple philosophy: over the long run, you have the right talent. They've put against obviously something that there's a want for out there. They will end up attracting consumers into your franchise. If over the long run you ignore that, you will end up having talent walking out of your door, and eventually you will have consumers not coming to your franchise anymore, and you don't have a company anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're a polluter, that may be a good objective, but it's not what we're leading for.
No, but I just want to underscore, this is not just an issue for public companies, as Mars well illustrates, but we're seeing this as a concern across the public and private company sectors, as well as major nonprofits.
This is not
and
just
others.
driven by investor calls.
This isn't. It's not just driven by Larry Fink. You do not need Larry Fink as an investor in your company to be paying attention to this.
No, I totally agree with that. Not at all. It's,
So Brad, talking about investors, let's go to that fifth point there. And because, actually the pressure in that letter is going up, and here he's saying we will be increasingly disposed to vote against management and board directors when companies are not making sufficient progress on sustainability-related disclosures and business practices and plans underlying them. That's a very strong statement. Will you see that happen? Do you think that's going to happen? Not just with Fink, but more generally, that investors are really going to raise their hand and say, no.
Yeah, it is a very strong statement. I think you are starting to see some early indications of that happening. And again, kind of Larry Fink's specific statement on this is going to push that forward a little bit more. BlackRock, has long had a really strong approach to investment stewardship. And just on the discussion a minute ago about talent, one of the things that they've been vocal about in the past is the importance of sustainability and corporate purpose in both employee attraction and employee retention, and making sure you have the right workforce. So, BlackRock has led on this for many years, but they haven't always backed shareholder proposals on climate-related issues, and they've received some criticism for that. What it appears that they've done kind of in what they've put forward in this letter and the case that they've made is they feel that, given that they've been looking at these issues for several years and engaging for several years, that companies really have had enough time to put forward a robust sustainability disclosure and strategy framework in-house, and that now they're ready to take it to the next level to hold those companies responsible and accountable for those plans and strategies. And I think that's most apparent in their decision to join Climate Action 100 Plus. That's a global set of about 400 investors with assets under management of more than 40 trillion that are really focused on targeting the world's largest corporate greenhouse gas emitters and engaging them to take action. So I think this statement in the letter at large is really reflective of how dramatically the investor mindset is changing around these issues and the plans for large investors to get much more engaged on these issues.
Yeah, and actually you're raising an interesting point that to some extent is also making up for some things where BlackRock, and again I want to emphasize here, we're not here to specifically criticize BlackRock. I think it's just Larry Fink's very outspoken, but we see this more generally with investors now, that there is a sort of awareness that I really need to act on what I've been saying in the past. And Paul, I want to go to you. I want to ask you, because there was an interesting piece on Bloomberg last week that really said this letter is muddling the waters a little bit, because on the one hand we were talking about ESG, environment, social governance. There's just a good business case to be made, as Klaus earlier said. But on the other hand, there's an element here of social responsible investment, like, look, we need to make up for this. There's lots of problems in the world, and we need to take our responsibility to deal with this. And the criticism that the Bloomberg piece had was saying, this is muddling the waters. I mean, both are important, but there are two different things, and kind of sort of putting them all together here in this letter doesn't particularly help businesses. So what you read that piece too. I asked you to read it.
Right.
I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, so I think the Bloomberg made an interesting point but it's a little more historic. I think historically there was a pretty strong distinction between your socially responsible investors. Often they were religious-based organizations who would come and say, company, we want you to do this because we think it's the right thing to do. And then there were people who took an approach from the ESG side, which is we're looking at risks and opportunities, and in terms of long-term shareholder value, we want you to do these things. So you had value versus long-term shareholder value. I think that distinction is really breaking down to the extent it was there in the past. Fink isn't muddying the waters. The waters have, I think, converged. So, for example, if you are a socially responsible investor, for many years now, actually, you've needed to make the case that doing what you believe is the right thing is also in the best interest of shareholders in the long term in terms of economics. Similarly, from the ESG standpoint, the reason why shareholder value is imperiled to some extent is if you don't offer products and services that are consistent with the values of your consumers and your employees. So you can think of shareholder value and values as sort of a yin and yang. Right. They reinforce each other. And then finally, from the company's standpoint, what drives a company? It's a combination of concern for shareholder value and, frankly, the values that the company stands for. So I think there may have been a distinction in the past, but there's a convergence now.
Right. Very good. I'd like to encourage the audience to actually put in questions, and I'm glad to see that some people are doing this. One question that just came in, and that I'm going to put to the group before we move on, is profits are relatively easy to measure, and we have nearly century-old systems for doing so. How do we consistently measure ESG across entities, and should ESG disclosures be audited? Sorry, I missed the part of this. Should it be audited as financials are? Actually, I'm going to, instead of addressing it now, this is actually the critical part of our next section. So if the question asker allows it, we'll come back to that question, because you're getting at the heart of some of the things that we want to do. So we're going to talk about financial reporting now, but we're going to ask you two poll questions. We're going to show the results next to each other because they really help us a little bit to see what the sentiment of our audience is. So our first poll question is going to come up right now, and that poll question is, if we're seeing it, are we seeing it? Yes, there. The first poll question is, what do you think of the following statement by Larry Fink? Disclosure should be a means to achieving a more sustainable and inclusive capitalism. Right? That's, again, strong statement. Disclosure should be a means to achieving a more sustainable and inclusive capitalism. And then there's a next question, which I want you to answer also, because we really like to see a look at those together. The quality of reporting metrics today is insufficient to reflect a company's commitment to sustainability. And again, with all these statements, you can agree somewhat strongly or somewhat strongly disagree or have a neutral view. So the first is, disclosure really is important if we want to achieve this, but secondly, the question is the quality really good enough to get there? Okay, and we'll give it a little bit more time to get your homework done, and that will then give our panelists a time to really think about how we should respond to this. Okay, we're going to close the call in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this is interesting because actually, the responses to the two questions are not very different. Most of you strongly agree that this is what needs to be done, but most of you also strongly agree that the quality of the metrics is insufficient. So we really have this sort of dual position. It needs to get done, but we don't think it's good enough. So we got a real problem here. And again, to somewhat agree is, again, the distribution of the response is pretty much the same. Mm-hmm. So Klaus, let me start with you, because this is, I think, actually exactly driving the problem we're getting at. We all know it's important, but we're all deeply dissatisfied with what we're having right now.
Yeah, no, thank you. First of all, I think it would be, interesting if those that have voted, as a few people that either somewhat agree or is in the middle on both questions. Maybe it's the same people, maybe it's not, but it would be, if there's any way you feel to come forward with some commentary in the questions. But it would be interesting to hear more about, actually. Not that I have an issue with your voting, but it's interesting. Maybe you have some insights that are of value to all of us, because clearly I would vote like the majority on this chart as a profession that is looking across the industries that we operated in, and also as an executive here at Mars Incorporated, I have the same view, and so does my colleagues in the sustainability team. I think we've all done lots of work to come up with certain methodologies, but clearly we need to create better structure around it. At least my opinion, for challenge out here in the panel and this audience is that we need to have as an aspiration to get closer to how we measure things like the financial data. Given the criticality and the focus of it, we cannot have that this falls into data that is subject to a lot of change and restatement, that therefore run the risks of being skewed in a certain way for marketing purposes, greenwashing as some call it. I think this is what must not happen, and maybe it is today, but this is some of the things we need to work on. So we really believe in working on better disclosure, maybe DCFD, etc. Better consistent measurement. And I would say I think a lot of great progress out there, and maybe some congruence on how to measure the environmental areas, and even because the difficult thing is not what goes on inside my own four walls. We are measuring the extended supply chain, and that is harder, but there is some science-based methodologies that we can really start to use. Social issues, much more difficult, much more subjective, and certainly clear, but it's becoming table stakes to have this sorted out, and I think it will feature much more in the analysis of companies, from a risk assessment, from a creditworthiness assessment, etc. And clearly, if you're a public listed company, people want to invest in you. So I think it's really important. And the role of finance in this is critical.
Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second also, Brad. I just want to ask you to sort of also respond to this outcome. There's somebody actually in the chat box who's saying the poll results are not surprising because one would expect the audience on this webinar to be highly predisposed to having these issues advance. There's also somebody who's saying, I voted neither because I'm unfamiliar with current metrics. So I think that I'd like you to respond to that because to some extent, is it also there's just insufficient information about what metrics are there, which gives our level of comfort.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, that's right. I think looking at the questions together and the responses, I think they really help make apparent what the real need and opportunity for wider engagement by the finance and accounting community to get more engaged on the sustainability disclosures and tracking of sustainability metrics by companies. In regard to the comment about not quite sure of what the sustainability metrics are out there today, I think we hear that quite a bit from finance teams that are relatively new to this area and aren't as familiar with the many different types of frameworks, standards, and metrics that are out there today for reporting. On the flip side of that comment is a need for some convergence around these types of metrics working towards more consistent language around how information is presented and reported and how it's calculated. And ultimately, again, I think it really reflects the opportunity and the need for a lot of finance engagement on this topic within companies.
Paul, there's actually a point there which is a nice segue to what I'd like you to talk about a little bit, and that is the comment, what about addressing how companies even select which elements they want to take action on? Disclosure is tied to action, so that there's something to report on. Now, at the conference board, we're doing a lot of work on that to actually look annually, what do companies actually disclose and how do they disclose? So can you speak a little bit to that point that perhaps illustrate how important it is for companies to think what it is that they need to report on?
I think that's critical. So we just recently did a global survey of sustainability disclosures at 6,000 companies across the globe. Focusing on those 6,000 and then really drilling down into the S&P 1200. And one of the lessons of that is that sustainability disclosure is actually quite on the uptick. If you look at the sort of top 20 metrics across those 1,200 companies, that's 24,000 items. And disclosure of that on average has gone from 40% at companies to 60% over the last few years. So sustainability disclosure is on the rise. At the same time, including in greenhouse gas emissions, at the same time, performance hasn't necessarily tracked disclosure. So what does that suggest to us? What it suggests to us, and we're hearing this from companies directly, is that they need to do a better job, and they want to do a better job of really focusing on the metrics that matter to them. That may cause the gap between what you're disclosing and how you're performing to shrink. So there's a real desire by companies, I think, and I think it would be helpful to everyone, including investors, for companies to focus on those subjects and those metrics that matter. I would also note that when it comes to disclosure, metrics are one thing, but just like in financial reporting, the MD&A is really just as important. The description of your business and your challenges, the narrative description, is just as important in many ways as the numbers. And so, this isn't all just about putting a lot of figures out there. So that was one of the big findings out of a report that I think ties into these, these results.
There's a lot of different metrics there. It's a great report, and we've been doing that for a while, so we can track it over the years. But when it comes specifically to disclosures about, for example, greenhouse gas emissions and climate, there is quite a bit of increase in reporting going on in those specific areas also.
That's exactly right. And you can see that the reporting has dramatically increased, but so have greenhouse gas emissions. And that may be because companies are now disclosing, under pressure, more information about their carbon emissions, but it's actually not perhaps an area of intense focus for them. Now, maybe it should be, but it hasn't been one of the areas that they think they actually can have a big impact on. A couple other things that came out of the recent report. One is that the regulatory pressure for disclosure in this area is going to continue. And so people need to keep an eye on what's coming out of Europe, but also out of Asia, because many of these regulations have extraterritorial impact. And I would note that in addition to carbon disclosures, there's a lot of pressure right now and a lot of change in how companies are reporting on gender-related issues. This is another real hot area. It's one, frankly, where it's relatively easier for companies to do reporting. So in terms of gender pay equity, that does have some challenges in reporting, but board diversity and so forth, there's a lot of shareholder pressure in that area and a lot of peer pressure in that area and a lot of employee pressure in that area. So I think we're going to see increased.
But there is a question here which I find interesting. I
Sure.
really appreciate people very actively in the chat box, and we probably
Yeah,
can't deal with all
yeah.
your things. But there's one comment I really like, and that's somebody says, in many cases, third-party assessments, regulators, whoever
Yeah.
else, are driving what companies are disclosing, and it feels often like checking the box to focus on getting better scores than focusing on metrics that really matter to our companies.
That's right. And I think we're going to see a change here. I think something that companies are now grappling with is, look, there are 6 different or 7 different major reporting frameworks. There are 200 or so different rating agencies that have been driving the boat here. But I think as sustainability reporting goes mainstream, both in terms of more companies doing it, and frankly, it's becoming mainstreamed within companies. And we're here to talk about that. CFOs care about it. General counsels care about it. CEOs care about it. So I think as that happens, companies are now going to be focusing, okay, wait a second. We're not just going to be captives of these, and I mean this in the nicest sense, of these outside rating agencies that we're trying to serve. We really have to figure out what matters to us. And it's a big burden on companies to figure out who's involved in the room and figuring out what matters to you, what framework you use to figure out what matters to you. And that should lead to both more focused disclosures, more meaningful disclosures. It may not lead to as much comparability across companies, but ultimately I think investors are going to benefit from having more meaningful disclosure.
Brad, let me go to you. I want to bring it back a little bit to the finance function specifically, because if there's one area in the company where accuracy really is absolutely critical, it's in the finance function. That's probably why there's a lot of skepticism in the among finance executives around it. So what are we seeing in terms of improvement of those quality of these metrics? Can the finance function really be ready to use those metrics in reporting?
Yeah, thanks, Barna. Quality of the sustainability data, has been a consistent challenge and is still a really significant issue, as demonstrated by the number of restatements you see in sustainability reports. And I think what's happening today is that CFOs and finance teams are learning and recognizing that most large companies today are publicly reporting some type of sustainability data. That may be through their corporate sustainability report. It may be through a disclosure response to the CDP. They're also providing that data through private reporting, such as those surveys for sustainability ratings organizations, or in many cases, they may have a large customer that has a supplier scorecard on sustainability that the company's expected to respond to. So this data is getting shared outside of the organization, but it's also usually being collected outside of the organization's typical financial reporting system, and is probably not subject to the same types of internal controls as other types of financial data. And that's where CFOs and finance teams are recognizing a need for much more engagement. Now, there are some efforts and signs of improvement in this space and some changes happening. And one is starting with working towards some type of global reporting standard with, again, consistent terminology, consistent measurement on material and relevant areas of interest for organizations. You can see that through the broad support for the recommendations of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which came out a few years ago, an agreement to seek convergence by a number of different groups to follow those recommendations. Likewise, just this week, there's a meeting of the Big Four accounting firms where they're being asked to provide and develop a common framework for corporate reporting on the SDGs. And then the other area that I think you see some movement on is, again, this involvement by CFOs, by investor relations, even by internal audit, in thinking through the data that's being provided and getting involved in both the data collection, the data reporting, and the goal establishment process for sustainability metrics. And that information is ultimately also being utilized for internal management reporting and internal decision making. And that's where, when we talk about this comment around relevance and figuring out what's right for the organization, where the real opportunity is how do you utilize the information that you have collected through the organization and think about using that information for better decision making for the business and what's going to add value for the business. And that's where Accounting for Sustainability, or A4S, the organization I'm with, is really focused on working with CFOs and their finance teams on understanding practical guidance on how to do that, and to help them address not just disclosure-related issues, but some of this internal management accounting by learning from other finance teams as to how to take that forward. And thanks for sharing the slide on there, which it demonstrates some of the practical guidance that's publicly available through the accountingforsustainability.org website.
It's great work that you guys are doing, and it's very important to the field. Klaus, there's a question here which actually leads into the question I wanted to ask you anyway. So there's a person here who's saying, I'm personally convinced sustainability finance will be key in the next 3 years, yet the finance top management of my company is still a bit skeptical. Any advice? So you are our true practitioner here as a CFO. I wanted to ask you sort of, what is the sentiment among your peers? Are your peers ready to go? Or is there still a lot of work to be done to satisfy people on your teams who are actually thinking like, we need to move faster on this? And what is holding CFOs up in sort of driving this forward?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I guess it all depends, but I think what I think we need to focus on is, there's different ways of thinking about this, and this needs to start with, a more, let's call it a more purposeful belief, that this matters. And I don't know how, to the person asking the question, you can influence top management, on that. But in the end, if we want to avoid that this is a tick in the box and potentially even greenwashing, as it was discussed a little earlier, this has to be much more central, to the strategy. Now, at least here at Mars, and me included, I already said it earlier, I think it is hypercritical, and I want to, at most days, I try to be a positively thinking CFO, and I do believe, naively so maybe, that in every breakdown there is a breakthrough, and I do think some of the matters we're discussing here are a breakdown or heading towards a breakdown, and I think there is an innovative breakthrough here, and I don't understand why people don't want to be part of innovating. That's always more fun than destroying. So that's how we think about it. This is how I think about it, and that makes it a lot easier to think about the role it plays. And then I talked earlier about my version of articulating what I call the value creation formula from the textbook of valuation, but and I think finance sits squarely in the middle of this, because at various levels, operational and strategically, we see and we control, the flow of money, in business. We provide a lot of backward-looking and forward-looking information that, influence, decision-making. And I think we are an objective, voice in a company that sees the end-to-end, picture, probably only alongside the CEO, and that makes it a great thing to work in finance for many reasons, and therefore also to influence this topic here. So how may finance executives at all levels start to build an influencing, agenda here that can drive the company.
So a lot of the original work when it comes to sustainability metrics in business were done by people in the sustainability function. Mm-hmm. That's where a lot of this started. So I think the question I have is, who should own the sustainability data in the end in the company? Should that be the CFO? Should these sustainability metrics actually become a comprehensive part of your reporting system in addition to all the financial metrics that you're reporting on? Or is it still kind of a separate reporting thing?
So I don't know if we need to be that territorial about it, but I do think given the importance of this, this area that I as a CFO, even for a private company, because I have also my reporting requirement, there is no choice but to have a much stronger overview and influence, and that may mean control eventually of this data. At least, I'm on a mission to make sure that this is of good enough audit quality that we can use this data internally and externally for all the things you mentioned, and Paul mentioned earlier that this is being used for, which on some days scares me because I don't know fully the quality of this and what we're really saying, whether it's a commitment or it's a backward-looking measure. So, I can only tell you that I've implanted 2 finance people in the sustainability team. Actually, they wanted finance people to be part of the sustainability team. And in my organization, there is the long-term destiny for a number of the areas that sits within the sustainability team, acknowledging that they do many things, not just measurement and reporting, should come to finance, should be part of the remit of the internal audit function to oversee the quality of the work that's being done, etc., and maybe my external auditors. And I know from some of my colleagues that I've spoken to that they see increasingly that it is actually moving into finance, some of those responsibilities that I talked about. But I do think sustainability is a company-wide agenda. Measurement and the quality of that data, yes, probably. But I do think this is only one part of it. There is a big piece of work to put this into the strategies, to make this an integral part of the 3-year, 5-year, whatever time frame you work on, investment framework, and of course tracking it, setting target and tracking them, both leading and lagging indicators is critical. And there is no better function in my view than to drive that than the finance function often.
Yes, it's a great insight that you're providing. That basically what you're saying, instead of telling sustainability people they have to come to finance, you actually say the finance people have to go to sustainability, and you actually put your people on that team, which I think is a really interesting point that you're making, a good recommendation.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think what you need to do is, frankly, your finance folks or your M&A people need to build sustainability factors into evaluating their cost of capital when you're deciding whether to make an investment of whatever sort. So it becomes part of the things you look at. When I worked at a media company, we looked at things like the rule of law, press freedom, sort of social issues, and trying to figure out the riskiness of a particular investor. So those were actually sort of sustainability, CSR issues that we looked at, but we built it into our analysis, into our financial and deal analysis. Because I think what really has to happen here, what Klaus was talking about, is how do you get the CFO's attention? It's got to be based on the business case. And if it's part of the company's strategic planning, its budgeting process, then it will naturally and more easily flow into external disclosures because it really is core part of your business. It's natural, it's not forced if you start with what really matters to the company, and then it flows out to the outside world.
Klaus, please.
No, I'm just going to reinforce what Paul, and it's like many other things we do that we are, whether it is on growth and product innovation and so on. Here was our strategy, here what's coming out, and see what we're doing. I think this year needs to be part of the same agenda, and frankly, I mean, it's what is expected, and I agree with you. It becomes a lot easier to talk about rather than to try and retrofit the metrics in the story, which we may all have been accused of trying to do in the past when it was a little bit less center focus of what really is one of the big strategic challenges of business communities or corporations.
Time is running very fast, and Paul, but there are two issues I
Yeah,
very briefly
very
want you
quick,
to
yeah.
address, but only briefly. One
Sure.
is the role of public policy. There's actually a comment here and saying that's actually the elephant in the room because public policy, at least in the US, isn't really active in this space. So brief comment on that. And then the other issue is to what extent can accuracy be supported by the use of assurance services, and if so, for what kind of data and what kind of service, and maybe to that latter point, Brad also want to say one or two things.
Sure. I think public policy is already affecting disclosures because from requirements outside the U.S. I do think that at some point in the horizon, we're going to see more requirements coming out of the federal government. I mean, you're already seeing it in the human capital management area. But I think that it's really incumbent on companies to do the best possible job they can now in the absence of directives from the SEC, which may help shape and even hold off a little bit of regulation in the future. In terms of assurance services, how do you make sure that what you're reporting is actually accurate? We have seen an increase in companies using external assurance services, but it's interesting. They use it for only some of the data. So greenhouse gas emissions is an area where companies often use external assurance services or some form of assurance services. The type of services they use vary. Sometimes it's, more often than not, it's an outside accounting firm, but there are also other firms that companies use in this area. So there's a great degree of flexibility in what data you double check and who does the double checking for you.
Right. Brad, any views on the use of assurance services?
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I agree with Paul, and I think you also see some differences geographically. So assurance and the type of assurance being done and who it's provided by varies around the world, and we definitely are seeing movements towards types of positive assurance across Europe. In the U.S., it's still largely negative assurance or some type of review statement that's issued. That is intended to help look at usually the greenhouse gas emissions that are reported. The one area that I'd highlight and I think is useful for any organization, though, is as Klaus mentioned earlier, the potential involvement from internal audit is a great way to take an initial step to kind of understand the quality of the data in-house first and to make improvements to the systems for reporting that will ultimately benefit any external assurance that you secure or see.
Good. I want to wrap up this discussion really sort of broadening the picture a little bit again. And Klaus, I really want to ask you a little bit about sort of we can talk about the accuracy of the data reporting, but you also feel strongly about sort of more the strategic role of the finance function. I just want to tee this up by showing you one chart from the Conference Board Annual C-Suite Challenge. We survey our C-Suite every year, and it really allows us to look at sort of, what are the most important pressures that CEOs or CFOs or CHROs face. And what you see in this chart is that impact of climate change on our business. It's not at the top, and we've seen that from other surveys as well. I think there's surveys reported this week at the World Economic Forum saying the same thing, that there's a lot of good talk about it, but if you ask about what the biggest issues are, then things like uncertainty around global trade or the economy or intense competition from technology is a much bigger thing than climate change. But it has gone up the list compared to previous years, so that's one piece of good news. And the other thing that I found striking here is that actually CFOs put it higher on the list than CEOs or CHROs. So that really I wanted to sort of bring up as a point to you on how can the finance function strategically, just beyond its reporting role, strategically contribute to companies playing a stronger role in environment and sustainability?
With the risk of repeating myself, I think finance sits very much in the center, and in most organizations, finance and strategy, at least at some level in the organization, are very tightly linked and probably both reporting into the CFO. So I do think through the way we run our value creation planning framework is definitely a way of promoting that debate. And again, I want to come back to this yin-yang, because there's a lot of the reporting that has this, like, A, it's backward looking, B, it's it maybe has too much of a smell of governance and check the box and something I have to do. And obviously it's all very important. So I'm not trying to underestimate that, but it may not necessarily in its own right drive the right action unless it is built into a more forward, not just looking, but committed, investment philosophy. So at least as a CFO and as a finance practitioner of all levels of the organizations I've worked in, I've always felt there's been a great opportunity because of the perspective one has on business to influence the agenda quite dramatically, and also the investments being made, and that's the opportunity, and that's certainly one that we are taking here at Mars, where probably have a CEO to score it higher than I do. I think on your list, though, it's also that you're showing on the screen right now. It's also a lot of the things that are on there has got, for some companies, even quarterly impact on their either results right now or the forecast that they're projecting, and of course, therefore, they end up being more important because there is always going to be the pressure of continuing to have strong performance, and to some degree that's not something we must give up. This is an and. We need to find innovative ways to do these things and put it into the priority mix of really something that is core to the long-term success of the company, and it will get its funding. But if there is a tight labor market or risk of recession, well, we got to manage that too.
Which really goes, this is a good segue. There was a question here I wanted to ask you, Paul. It's the role of the corporate board, because this is really an issue about short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. And Klaus, of course, right. You need to think about the quarterly results. I mean, you can't get away from them.
Right.
But the corporate board can provide some guidance to a company in terms of how to balance these challenges, right?
Right. It's a core responsibility of the board, and I think that all of this has implications for the composition of the board, for the structure of the board, what committees you have, for how the board allocates its time. And I think, if anything, the role of a director is going to become even more challenging, because it's one thing, to engage with stockholders, and now the challenge is to engage and respond to stakeholders of all kinds.
Very good. At the risk of running over, but we're not going to, because I'm going to ask you for a very quick poll question and a very quick response, but I want to put up the last poll question because it would really be cool to hear from the audience what they're thinking about. In order to drive sustainability and climate risk mitigation in corporations, the biggest game changer in the next years will be, so you can choose in terms of drive sustainability and climate risk mitigation. What is the biggest game changer? Is it government regulation that's going to change things? Is it the commitment to the long-term goal by investors and shareholders, what we just talked about? Is it a deeper and commonly agreed reporting standards by rating agencies? Is it culture change in corporations and commitment of senior management, which we talked about extensively? Is it customers? Or is it just a fallout from crisis and disasters that are pushing companies? So you have a few more choices here. So I give you a little bit more time, but not a lot, because we want to finish in about 2 minutes. So after this, I ask each of my panelists to just use 30 seconds to respond to the insights here. And we give it 5 more seconds to respond. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. I guessed that this would be an interesting question, and it is, because you get different opinions here, but most of them, more than 1/3, are saying it's really culture change in the corporation and commitment of senior management. But that is followed not too far by government regulation and a commitment to long-term goals by investors and shareholders. Brad, let me start with you. Would you agree with this ranking? Do you think that makes sense? Most of it is really about culture change in the corporation itself, or do you think these external factors matter too?
Yeah, thanks, Barn. I think they all have a role to play. I mean, I think what's driving culture change has been the investor interest, particularly on the public company side. And I think if in my view of what's made the biggest difference over the last 18 to 24 months, I think the investor action in this area is driving more company action, and I expect that to continue in the near term.
Klaus, 30 seconds.
I would agree with that. I think there's a linkage between all of them, and I'm I would agree that, changing the tone at the top is going to be important for changing any big direction of a company, including in this area.
Paul, final word to you.
I think it's going to be those three things of government regulation, investors, and commitment by senior management. And what, again, makes this different is this is not, you can see, it's not crisis driven. This is driven by more hydraulic pressures within the corporate world.
Right, that's very interesting. This was a great discussion. Thank you very much to the panel, Klaus Aagaard, Brad, thank you, Brad Sparks, thanking you, and Paul Washington, thanking you for joining us. Some more information about A4S is in the slide deck, which you can take a look at. Also, don't forget about the evaluations. We'd really like to hear from you about these webcasts. Come back next month. Next month we'll talk about a somewhat related topic. It's going to be about energy and commodity prices, but it's not unrelated to our discussion today. So love to have you here again. And again, we hope that you will in the future make use of our services at the conference board. Hope to see you again at Window On or any of the other webcasts that the conference board is producing. My name is Bart van Aert, Chief Economist at the conference.